again, everyone. It's your eccentric, spooky internet aunt, MadameMacabre again. I hope you've all been keeping safe and well. Today, I'm going to be looking into yet another one of my wonderful viewers' personal submissions. They're quite baffled by what they experienced, so they're reaching out for suggestions. So settle on in, my lovely friends. It's time for yet another real-life horror story. Today's submission was sent by Sam Calhoun 007, titled The Pit Fiend. Hello, MadameMacabre. Here's something that I experienced some time ago. I should clarify that before and even after this event, I am a hardcore skeptic when it comes to the paranormal. I don't know if it's some weird mental tic in me that forces me to demand evidence or always seek out a more logical conclusion, but whatever the case, this one event in my life has always bothered me. It's bothered me because it's something that I can't explain no matter how hard I try to. I could use something, anything, if you could. And even if you can't, then I hope you enjoy because it's at the very least entertaining. The summer before my senior year of high school, I, along with my older brother and 2 cousins, went to visit my grandfather and stay with him for a little while. For most, this would probably be something that teenagers would have dreaded, only finding solace in the company of my brother and cousins. But this wasn't the case for me. My grandfather owns a massive house located in the Appalachian foothills of Tennessee. I've been going there nearly every summer since I was a little kid, and it was practically a second home to me. I've also always been very close to my grandfather and cousins, so I thought that it would be nothing but good times for me. My grandfather, despite pushing 70, was as spry as they came. He was a former Marine who was built like an ox. He stood well over 6 feet tall and is a longbow hunter even today. To all others, he was a tough-as-nails cowboy-like figure, but to his grandchildren, he was a big softy. He was really just a big kid at heart. He taught me to love the outdoors, and I will always be grateful to him for that. Now, when I say that Grandpa's house was built in the mountains of Tennessee, I mean literally built on them. It's constructed overlooking a shallow valley about halfway up a ridge covered in trees. If you were to hike up that ridge, which we often did, you'd overlook vast forests and gently rolling mountains with sun and clouds above them. To this day, I cannot emphasize how beautiful it is out there, although every place you go has its downsides. We were in the middle of pretty backwoods lands. I'm pretty sure that the county my grandfather lives in was the inspiration for the movie Deliverance. The locals are generally quiet and distrustful of strangers, especially those from the north. I'm not kidding. The county's unofficial motto is, "Never occupied, never surrendered," and they make that very well known. Fortunately enough, my grandpa was a well-respected member of the community, and my family had been there enough times so we weren't considered to be true outsiders. We were planning on staying at the cabin for about a week, and for the first couple of days, everything went great. Although, if you've ever been in Tennessee in the summer, you should know that it gets about as hot and muggy as hell there. And for 4 people from Michigan, the nights were unbearable at times. One night, it was so hot in my room that I couldn't get to sleep no matter how hard I tried. So, seeing no other alternative, I decided to get up, go out to the living room, and watch videos on my phone like a normal person. About half an hour after doing this, one of my cousins, Emma, found me and joined me on the couch. I always liked Emma. She was a year younger than me, and she and I always had a kind of friendly rivalry when growing up. She was athletic, and I would often joke that when we were little kids, she would beat me up. She would always counter by saying she could still beat me up. We stayed up and talked for a while. I can't really remember what about, but it doesn't really matter. About an hour into our attempt to escape the ever-consuming muggy heat of the South, we heard something out in the distance. Keep in mind, this was in the summer, so all of the windows with screens were open. What we heard came from the ridge just beyond the house. I don't think I could ever really describe exactly what I heard, but it sounded kind of like a wolf's howl and that screaming sound that mountain lions make. If you haven't heard one, look it up. It's terrifying. It sounded like a mix between these, but deeper. Much much deeper. Whatever it was, it sounded as though it was coming from something much larger than a wolf. As creepy as that sound was, I honestly wasn't too scared. It freaked me out a little when I heard it, but mostly out of surprise. I turned to Emma. She and I laughed a bit and tried to guess whatever it could have been that made that noise, mostly joking around, as she suggested that it was a lost narwhal. We have a weird sense of humor. Regardless of what it could have been, we weren't that worried. We didn't hear it again after that, and it sounded quite far off. About an hour or so later, we heard something snap, and then a loud crash came from outside. My grandfather's house was built in such a way that even from the living room, I could see through the kitchen and out a large set of bay windows. These windows showed his driveway and shed. When I looked out, I saw the doors to the shed swinging wide open. They were open, and I know for a fact that we had chained those doors shut before we all went inside for the night. They have to in order to keep out bears, and we had some venison curing in there. Now, I should say that my first instinct was nothing paranormal. My first instinct was actually that the shed was getting robbed. The area was known for a population of marijuana farmers and meth labs, so I figured that they were junkies looking to pawn off some equipment for money. Thinking quickly, I told Emma to go and get everyone else up. She didn't hesitate and made her way to my grandfather's room, which was at the far end of the house. Now, I know you're going to think that I was an idiot for what I did next. I even think that I'm an idiot, but I thought that I would be enough to scare them off. After all, I was a varsity swimmer. I was about 6 feet tall and was heavily built from years of lifting and swimming. Even if that weren't enough, I decided to get a hunting rifle that my grandfather kept in the living room, just for a bit of added protection. I would like to clarify that I had absolutely no intention of trying to shoot anyone. I grabbed it so I would be armed or could possibly shoot over the junkies' heads to scare them off. Even so, it would have been nice to have a weapon, just in case. You never know when it comes to people that could very well be hopped up on drugs. I swung open the door that led to the porch. The porch overlooked the entire yard and gave me a perfect view of the shed. Plus, it was far enough away you could only get to it from the driveway by going up a narrow set of stairs. I figured that this was the most defensible position there was. Now, this might sound weird, but the first thing that struck me was the temperature. It was cold. Sure, it was in the middle of the night, and I was nervous about what would happen, but it was still Tennessee and in the middle of the summer, and that night had been near unbearably hot only a few minutes ago. And yet now everything was cold. I justified it in my head as just nerves, so I nutted up and drove the fear out of my voice, trying to turn it to anger. I called out, yelling at whoever was in the shed. I said something along the lines of, "You mother bleepers have 5 seconds to leave before I go medieval on you." And yes, there is a chance that I might have prepared that line ahead of time. I waited for a few agonizing seconds. Despite what still felt like chilly air, I was sweating, nervous for whatever would come next. What came next was something I could never have imagined, and something that I will remember until the day that I die. The moon was out, providing a nice amount of light, and my eyes had now fully adjusted to the dark. But that shed was as black as pitch. The first thing that I saw were its hands. They were long, sinewy things, tipped in what I imagined to be claws, although it was difficult to tell at my distance. These were not human hands. They were far too big. The fingers were too long. But they definitely weren't animal hands. Again, they had fingers, and they did look vaguely human, just not truly human. Whatever it was, the thing seemed to pull itself out of the shed, grabbing onto the edges of the doorframe first, and then lumbering out. I cannot describe the sheer terror I felt when I saw that thing come out of the shed. It wasn't a terror you get when watching a particularly scary movie. It was a primal fear, one meant to trigger a fight or flight response. The thing lumbered outside of the shed, facing me. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel them burrowing deep into mine. It stood upright, standing what looked like 8 or 9 feet tall. It must have been, as it had to stoop to get out of the shed, which I could easily walk through in and out without an issue. Whatever it was, it certainly was not human. It looked skinny, almost unnaturally so, as though it were starving. Its arms were disproportionately long and covered with thin hair. I couldn't see its head too well, but from the shape it looked vaguely human, but almost noticeably bestial, as though it were some strange amalgamation of the two. It was no bear. That thing could never have been a bear. I stood there, frozen, staring the creature down. What else could I do? I was afraid if I went for the door of the house, it would charge me, and there was no way in hell a thin piece of glass could keep it out if I managed to get to the shed. And so, I continued to look, stare, filled with the same primal terror that gripped me so tightly. Eventually, after what felt like a few minutes, it was probably closer to seconds, honestly, the creature started to slowly move toward me. It was like wolves circling and getting closer to their prey, as if it were testing to see how close it could get to me. Instinctively, I brought the rifle up to my shoulder and fired. Needless to say, I missed. Terror really messes with your ability to aim steadily, I'll tell you that much. My shot whizzed past the creature, missing its shoulder by a foot or so and piercing the wooden shed. I saw the creature flinch and tense up for a second, as though it were surprised by my shot. After I pulled back the bolt, I watched as the creature ran up the ridge away into the woods and towards the other side of the mountains. And yes, when I say running, I mean freaking running. It would run on 2 legs, albeit a bit clumsily, and then stumble forward. It would then run perfectly on all 4s in a sort of lumbering gait like a bear. It would do this for a few seconds before standing back up and repeating the process. I watched as it trailed off into the woods and out of sight, all the while terrified that it might decide that I was worth the trouble after all and would turn back. I leaned against the wall and clutched the rifle like a safety blanket in a silent panic. I didn't sob, I didn't do anything. I just sat there breathing heavily and with some difficulty. A few seconds later, the rest of my family threw the doors open in an absolute panic, all armed. I should understand why. I went out there alone and clearly shot at something. They saw that everything was clear and took me inside, trying to find out exactly what I saw. I couldn't really explain it to them. After all, how could I? I barely understood what I just saw. The only moment of true clarity that I had was when my brother and other cousin tried to go back out and check out the shed for whatever I might have seen. I immediately begged them not to. Seeing how terrified and intense I was, they agreed to wait until morning. Understandably, I didn't get any sleep that night. I kept expecting to look out my window and see that same creature looking at me, hungrily. I just sat there looking out at the ridge, scanning for any sign of movement. What we found the next morning was even more peculiar. The chain that held the door shut had been ripped off, and the venison that we were keeping in there was a bloody mess. It had been half eaten, with gore and body parts of the deer strewn about the room. The first logical option would be that it was a bear. It would make sense why it only went for the venison. However, the chains that we used, although they weren't the heaviest duty, were rated to be stronger than anything that a bear native to the region could possibly rip apart like what we saw. It would take a truly powerful animal to be capable of doing that. That night, my grandfather sat me down to talk with me in private. He gave me some whiskey and we smoked a bit of pipe tobacco to calm down for the night. Like I said, he was a cowboy kind of guy. He asked me to tell him what I saw. After a day to calm down and reflect, I was able to tell him everything. He didn't say anything when I told him about it. He just nodded and told me to keep going. When I finished, he smiled for a second, then lit his pipe. "There are strange things in the world," is all he said to me. I knew that he believed me. He didn't have to say it. I could see it in his eyes and hear it in his voice. He knew what I was talking about. He must have seen it before. Those next few days, I still didn't get much sleep. No matter how exhausting the day was, I would never be able to sleep there. So I spent most nights between short and often fitful bouts of sleep, and others watching videos on my phone, just trying to forget what I saw. I would see it, One last time. The last night that we stayed there, I was in another fit of sleeplessness. So as I was walking to the living room to carry on with my new nightly ritual, I passed by a large window that overlooked the valley. On a whim, I looked out, and there it was. It was standing right by the old large creek that we had caught crayfish from only a day earlier. And there it was, just standing there looking at the house, as if it were looking at me. I know that it wasn't a hallucination, or me just seeing things. It wasn't standing in the shade, it was in the middle of the field, a massive black figure standing in the middle of the moonlight. I immediately pulled out my phone and tried to take a picture of it. In my haste, I accidentally dropped my phone. Conveniently, I know, as if I were in a freaking horror movie. But I guess for once, movie tropes are actually somewhat accurate. Either that or I'm just an idiot. By the time I got back up to snap the picture of the creature, it was already gone, as though it knew what I was trying to do. I haven't gone back to my grandfather's house since that summer. Not for any real reason, mostly just because of college, trips with friends, work, and other obligations. I never really got the chance. But I do stay in touch with him, and this is something that we do talk about. He'll occasionally send me messages telling me if he's seen it again, or, on occasion, he'll send printed off articles from the local newspaper. Some of these articles talk about attacks on hikers, campers, and locals who wander into the forests, especially at night. One victim was a local woman who liked to walk her dog in the forest. She managed to run away and survived the attack, but her dog didn't. The other was a very experienced hiker and camper who went backpacking in the woods. He wasn't seen for months, but eventually, the authorities found a piece of his spine and his jawbone, both a few miles from where he was reported to be camping, and both showing signs of animal attack. I don't know what's out there, but whatever it is, it's dangerous, and I don't think it's natural. Please, anything would help put this to rest. Please, thank you, and good luck out there. Oh my goodness. Well, I'm gonna be honest with you. I don't think this is as much of a mystery as I thought it was before I read through this. I had my suspicions at a certain point, but the moment you mentioned the temperature fluctuation, my heart dropped. I think what you may have encountered was a Wendigo. I think this for many reasons. For one, you mentioned this being in the Appalachian Mountains. That land has a lot of strong ties to Native American people. I believe in particular that area is the Appalachian Cherokee tribe. Correct me if I'm wrong. But beyond that, everything you described about this creature is just spot on. Its appearance, its size, the noises it made, and most importantly, that temperature drop. I say this because I personally believe I've encountered a Wendigo on multiple occasions. And you can't unhear the unnatural noises they make. It's like nothing you can truly describe. You can't forget it. It's not natural. It makes me wonder, though, your grandfather seems to be doing okay out there on that land, and you mentioned something about there being bears frequently. Perhaps that's actually what's keeping your grandfather safe. See, in a lot of native beliefs, bears have a lot of spiritual significance and can be seen as protectors. And in the Wendigo legend in particular, bears are just about the only thing that Wendigos naturally kind of fear. I'm not sure if maybe your grandfather keeps like bear skulls or teeth or claws around his property, or there's just a lot of bears running around, but potentially that could be keeping the creature at bay. And if you are unfamiliar with Wendigos, some basic facts are essentially they are said to be like the living embodiments of frigid cold and starvation. So they are constantly hungry and looking for something to eat, which kind of adds up with breaking in to start eating the deer you had in the shed, and also why the temperature drops when they're around. It can go from a hot summer day to feeling like you just walked into a walk-in freezer. If you are interested in looking more into this creature in particular and the land that it's on, I would suggest doing some research on the local history, or even finding local tribes and reaching out to them and asking about their particular folklore and legends. But beyond that, just, the average rule. don't go into the middle of the deep, dark mountain forests at night. Anyway, I am so glad to hear that you made it out of this encounter without any physical injury. Thank you so much for sharing your experience with us, and if anybody down in the comments has any other points I've missed, or perhaps thinks it's something else that's more specific to the Appalachian region, I don't know, I am from the West Coast, so this is a whole different can of worms than what I'm used to. Again, if you have this knowledge that I don't, please feel free to share in the comments below. Anyway, that is all we have time for today, so I will catch you all next time with another one. And until then, remember, stay creepy.